Chapter 1. Why Didn't Black Lives Matter? When cultures clash, the winner often writes the history books, glorifying their own cause and disparaging their conquered foe. As Napoleon once said, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" I approach this investigation with an impartial lens, considering each fragment of historical evidence as a piece of a composite puzzle. It is my hope that when this puzzle is assembled, it will offer a clear picture to all parties seeking redemption and closure. It's been said that it is the truths of the matter that set us free. Race, the Root of All Evil, is a book searching for such truth. We cannot begin to understand the cries of Black Lives Matter without understanding why people of African ancestry were made to feel that their lives as a whole didn't matter in the first place. Living your whole life as a person of color in America, you always knew something was terribly wrong, but you could never quite put your finger on it. I remember when I was about 12 years old, my father sat me down to explain to me the abnormal, normalized facts of life when he was growing up. I suppose Dad was preparing me for what to expect from the world I was coming of age in. My father relayed to me the experiences of famous international celebrities of his day. Wealthy African Americans we watched in classic movies like Nat King Cole and Lena Horne. Megastars who filled showrooms at the El Rancho, Flamingo, and other venues, had to spend the night in substandard segregated motels. Legendary jazz musician Louis Armstrong, the man whose raspy voice had serenaded millions with tunes like What a Wonderful World. A superstar who is credited for inventing the New Orleans-style jazz. Louis Armstrong had traveled the world, rubbing shoulders with kings and queens, mingling with them on a first-name basis. However, upon returning to his hometown of New Orleans in the heat of Jim Crow, he was told he could only stay in run-down Negro-only hotels. In 1953, Academy Award nominee Dorothy Dandridge was performing at a Las Vegas hotel. During her downtime, between shows, she decided she would visit the pool area. After deliberately dipping her toe in the water, the staff ordered everyone out of the pool, then closed and drained the entire swimming pool. I thought my dad was making this up. However, I knew the torch had been passed to another generation when my own son questioned me of why he was constantly being pulled over by the police, simply because he was driving a brand new Hummer. These peculiar stories go back generation after generation, as far back as anyone can remember. The first step in understanding such a strange and complicated history is by coming to grips with the uncomfortable demons of our past. The truth can only set us free, if we tell it. Most people seeking to understand our jaded past are only familiar with the fact that people of European ancestry enslaved an estimated 12 million people of African ancestry. This has been the theme of every slave movie ever made, from Roots to 12 Years a Slave. It's always the same basic storyline. The bad white people enslaved the black people, and the good white people set the black people free. But no one has ever told us the story of how and why the Moors enslaved the Europeans. The story of slavery has always been pitched to us from a unilateral perspective, never bilaterally. I thought that was strange. People of African ancestry enslaved about the same number of Europeans as North Africans, who enslaved them nonetheless over a much longer period of time. And yet no one has mentioned it? In analyzing both sides of history, we can now begin to consider how bilateral enslavement has influenced modern-day racial conflict in the United States of America, and perhaps begin to understand why Dorothy Dandridge was not permitted to go into the pool. In considering how bilateral enslavement has impacted U.S. policies, I focused on finding historically accurate evidence to inform my thoughts and conclusions. I sought out scholars of history and educated myself on a variety of perspectives. The books I dove into during my research were as follows. The Barbary Wars, American Independence in the Atlantic World by Frank Lambert, 2005. Jefferson's War, America's First War on Terror, 1801 through 1805, Joseph Whelan, 2003. To the Shores of Tripoli, The Birth of the U.S. Navy and Marines by A.B.C. Whipple, 1991 and republished in 2001. Victory in Tripoli, How America's War with the Barbary Pirates Established the U.S. Navy and Shaped a Nation by Joshua E. London, 2005. These scholarly texts allowed me to create a timeline of history, linking conflicts between a newly formed United States of the past to the present-day chant around the world to finally make sure that Black Lives Matter. 1620 is the year England delivered its first shipment of African slaves to Virginia. Fast-forwarding over 150 years to 1776, America's independence from Great Britain marked an unprecedented era of economic liberty. Free from the Revolutionary War, America found itself inheriting England's slaves, as well as their system of law surrounding the treatment, status, and handling of slaves. The Founding Fathers grappled with their newfound slaveholdings, inheriting an English system and set of laws they had previously renounced while fiercely declaring their own independence. As they defined America as we know it today, the authors of the Constitution faced new and unprecedented challenges. Among these challenges was the persistent seizure and enslavement of American citizens and cargo ships traveling through the Straits of Gibraltar. These violent seizures of citizens and ships had been the plague of Europe for hundreds of years. The Barbary Pirates were viewed as the bullies of the Mediterranean, a group of religious zealots that nobody wanted to mess with. In 1785, when America was only 9 years old, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams decided it was time to confront the bullies of the Barbary coast, traveling to London to meet with Tripoli's ambassador, Ambassador Abd al-Rahman. It was the hopes of Thomas Jefferson to reach a diplomatic agreement to end the relentless attacks, tariffs, and ransoms being levied against American ships by North African pirates. America at the time was paying 10% of its GNP to the Barbary states. In seeking out a diplomatic agreement, Jefferson pleaded with Tripoli's ambassador, fervently questioning what right the Barbary states had to prey on American ships, demand tariffs, and enslave both crews and passengers. The ambassador Abd al-Rahman coldly replied to Jefferson, stating, "It was written in the Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon whoever they could find, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise." Pushing for a diplomatic agreement, Jefferson swiftly replied to the ambassador that the United States was not a Christian nation and played no part in the Crusades or the Catholic Reconquista of Andalusia. Without missing a beat, Ambassador Abd al-Rahman did not fail to brag about the size of his own commission in the transaction. The outcome of these decisions became clear. If America chose to pay protection money to North Africa, they would have an alternative to the relentless piracy they endured. It seems it was this very moment of contention with the ambassador of Tripoli that precipitated Jefferson's strong will to bring war upon the Barbary kingdoms as soon as he had command of the American forces. Contrary to Jefferson, many Americans, John Adams among them, made the case that it was far wiser for the USA to fork over tariffs and protection money to North Africa, rather than experience piracy and the accompanying loss of trade. Keeping the hearts of the nation in mind, Adams eerily warned that a battle against North African pirates would be too rugged for our people to bear. We ought not to fight them at all unless we are determined to fight them forever. Adams' warnings were left to echo into silence as reports of the maltreatment of enslaved Americans spread abroad. America's wait-and-see approach to the North African conflict quickly changed the conversation from diplomacy to preparation of war. Many look back and feel war would be justifiable when you consider the historical recounts of brutality, mistreatment that enslaved Americans experienced at the hands of the Barbary Coast pirates. Historian Thomas Sowell offered his perspective, saying, "The treatment of white galley slaves at the hands of the Barbary Coast pirates was even worse than the treatment of black slaves picking cotton in the South. Most of these slaves spent the rest of their lives doing hard labor for Muslim masters in northern Africa or manning the oars on Barbary galleys. Most of the women ended up in the harem. The Barbary states of North Africa had plundered seaborne commerce for centuries. They demanded tribute, money, seized ships, and held crews for ransom or sold them into slavery." Although Professor Sowell's vivid perspective shines light on the possible motivation for Jefferson's call for war against North Africa, I wholeheartedly disagree with his generalized comparison. I have read the diaries and essays of European slaves who escaped their captivity in North Africa, living to tell their stories. Yes, definitely cruel and brutal. However, I've also read about the actions of some slave masters in the Southern American states. The inhuman practices of feeding the babies of enslaved women to crocodiles. I have not heard every report. Without that knowledge, how could anyone compare European slavery to American slavery? How could anyone compare anyone's pain, for that matter? It's my opinion that the mutual enslavement and terms thereof by both parties were indeed pure evil. In May of 1801, conflict between North Africa and the United States reached a boiling point when the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Calamansi, declared war on the United States with the ultimate motivation of demanding more revenue. Pasha was an esteemed title held by many rulers of Tripoli. In retaliation to this declaration of war, the United States commissioned its newly formed naval squadrons to head out on their first overseas military engagement. The Marines hymn many Americans living today are quite familiar with carried the American soldiers into war. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea. First to fight for right and freedom, and to keep our honor clean. We are proud to claim the title of United States Marines. The battles began violently, with Tripoli successfully capturing a U.S. Navy ship, the U.S. Philadelphia, capturing and enslaving most of the crew. The few American soldiers that did escape went into hiding, but did not back down. Instead of disappearing into safety, American Navy officers snuck into the Tripoli harbor, where the ship was kept overnight, killing the guards and setting fire to the Philadelphia to prevent the enemy from benefiting from the use of their ship. The tactful and resilient approach of America in its fight against North Africa brought wide-reaching respect to the USA as a nation to be reckoned with. Employing diplomacy, backed by resolute force, the conflict with North Africa eventually paved way to the end of the practice of paying tribute to the pirate states. The international dispute involving the United Kingdom and the Netherlands ultimately ended in 1815. American ships could not pass freely without fear of piracy and loss of trading. A short 40 years later placed another important landmark in the timeline of American history, with a young Abraham Lincoln setting out to end slavery in the United States. His hopes to end the practice of slavery was overshadowed by the deep-seated fear of revenge. Many of Lincoln's contemporaries viewed him as insane. Pushing forward against this fear, on January 1, 1863, Lincoln declared that all slaves in America were free. While this declaration was groundbreaking and novel, not much changed for the enslaved. They continued to work their fingers to the bone for landowners in the southern states for decades to come. Even with Lincoln's purposeful declaration, the United States Civil War ripped through the infant nation. The Northerners won many battles, the most famous of which took place in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The 4-year-long Civil War grounded to a halt on April 9, 1965, with the South admitting defeat. 5 days later, while enjoying a theater performance in Washington around 10 p.m., Lincoln was shot by the famous actor John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died a few short hours later. In 1866, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, began amidst the political, economic, and social upheaval that was the aftermath of the American Civil War. Originating in Tennessee, this movement quickly spread to other states in the South as it targeted the most primal fears of Southern white populations. Claiming to seek justice for crimes against whites, reiterating antiquated social status quos, and ensuring white supremacy were top priorities for the Klan. The history of the extreme violence of the transatlantic slavery trade, as well as America's enslavement at the hand of Barbary forces, culminated in the widespread acceptance of the belief that truly freeing slaves in the United States would mean suicide. Fueled with the same paranoia as the Founding Fathers who called slavery a necessary evil, American slave masters remembered Tripoli, the terrorization perpetuated on Europeans by the North African pirates. Slave masters entertaining such fears were ignorant of the fact that the people of African descent are one of the most culturally diverse people in the world. There are at least 3,000 ethnic groups and 2,000 languages spoken in Africa. Many African groups taken from their homeland were as foreign to each other as their European masters were to them. But all the slave owners saw was brown skin and a fictional doctrine called race. They lived in constant fear of slaves mounting an insurrection. One of the slave masters' greatest fears was also that the whipping, family separation, rape, and crimes they carried out would come back to haunt them as forms of revenge. While African Americans were free on paper, much of the freedom they were promised was reversed during the years post-Reconstruction. This left the fate of African Americans to be gradually turned over to individual states, many of which adopted restrictive Jim Crow laws. These hateful laws enforced segregation on the basis of race alone. These archaic rules and regulations, based upon British systems of law and the general running of penal colonies, were aimed at keeping African Americans in a similar status level of those granted to prisoners of war. The hateful and infamous words Senator Ben Tillman spit out on the South Carolina Senate floor on March 23, 1900, still stains our present thoughts and society. Tillman stated, "I have never believed the black man to be equal to the white man, and will not submit to his gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him." Examining these words, we can see Tillman believed that one group has the right to enslave another. However, this was based on the erroneous belief that humans can be categorized by race in any meaningful way. His beliefs mark history with a sad effort to marginalize and oppress the African American people in his own nation and beyond. During the Radical Reconstruction period of 1867 through 1877, many pro-slavery writers argued that without slavery, which supposedly suppressed their animalistic tendencies, blacks were reverting to criminal savagery. Books and literature of the post-slavery era did much to create an atmosphere of fear, portraying former male slaves as innately savage, animalistic, destructive, and criminal, deserving punishment, maybe death. One such author writes, "This brute is a fiend, a sociopath, an antisocial menace." Charles H. Smith, a popular writer of the 1890s, claimed, "A bad Negro is the most horrible creature upon the earth, the most brutal and merciless." Another author, Clifton R. Breckinridge, of 1900, a contemporary of Smith's, said of the black race, "When it produces a brute, he is the worst and most insatiate brute that exists in human form." George T. Winston, 1901, another negrophobic writer, claimed, "When a knock is heard at the door, a white woman shudders with nameless horror. The black brute is lurking in the dark, a monstrous beast, crazed with lust. His ferocity is almost demoniacal. A mad bull or tiger could scarcely be more brutal. A whole community is frenzied with horror, with the blind and furious rage for vengeance." Our turbulent history of slavery has seeped into present day, with white supremacy groups fearing much of the same things their forefathers feared over 100 years ago. A fateful day may arrive when revenge is enacted against the population identifying with whiteness by people of color. Through analyzing scholarly text, historical battles, and the fundamental facts surrounding America's history of bilateral enslavement, we can begin to understand the motivations and fuel behind race theory today. The highly tense and turbulent environment that categorizes our understanding of race today can be traced back to these early erroneous beliefs about race. It is only when we begin to thoughtfully navigate through this complex history that we can begin to understand why there is no need to categorize dynamic and unique human beings by the made-up construct of race. By focusing on unity, harmony, and mutual understanding, we can begin to heal as a nation and move forward without tumultuous racial tension holding us back.